Hey, Dave Stallman here, and we're going to talk cosine function, cosine equation. So I want to review with you how we get the cosine curve. You'll remember that when you have a unit circle and you have a point on the circle that the radius is 1, that's like a hypotenuse, and the coordinates of that point, those xy coordinates, are that x leg of the triangle and that y leg of the triangle. And when that's the angle, the cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and so the cosine of the angle equals adjacent over 1, and so cosine is equal to x. Now I want you to notice up here how confusing this is. I have y equals cosine of x. Now here's what's going on. We have two different graphs going on here. This graph has an x coordinate here and a y coordinate there. And so any of these points have an x and a y value, okay? And this graph here has an x coordinate and a y coordinate, but this x coordinate is not x, it's the angle. And this y coordinate is the cosine, which is this x value. And so it's a little bit confusing, okay? In fact, it's a lot confusing. And so you're just going to have to struggle with that, and I know you can get it. Now, here's how the cosine works. On this y-axis, we're going to graph the cosine. And over here, the cosine is the distance from the center in the x direction over to the circle. So when we are at 0 degrees, we're at this point on the circle, and that x distance is the radius, which is 1. And so on this graph, when we're at 0 degrees, we're at 1. And what happens is that as we move around the circle to 90 degrees, and so as we move along from 0 to 90 degrees, the x value of each of these coordinates gets smaller and smaller and smaller until at 90 degrees, the x value, or the side to side, is 0. And in fact, the curve will look like this. Now, as we go from 90 to 180 degrees here, or 90 to 180 degrees here, all these x values get negative more and more until you reach that point, and the x value is -1. And so it looks like this. And then as we go around to 270, the x values are still negative, but they're getting smaller negative until they reach 0. And then the x values are very small, but they get bigger until they reach 1 at 360 degrees. Now, because this is a circle, and because we have coterminal angles, we can keep going around this circle in a positive direction, and this will keep repeating itself off to the right. And if we start at 0 degrees and go in a negative direction, this keeps repeating itself in the other direction, like that. Now, this equation here describes this curve, okay? Now, the last video, we had the sine curve, and we described these things. Now we've got the cosine curve. And there's a couple of things maybe I can clarify better. We always have a max and we always have a min, and then we always have a middle, okay? This K value is, we call it the vertical shift, but it's the location of the middle. And so if we were to raise this up, that K value would tell you at what value the middle is. This A value is the amplitude, and it's actually like we're going to call it the absolute value of the amplitude, but what it gives you is the distance from middle to max, or middle to min. So essentially, from the middle up, that's the amplitude, and the middle down, that's the amplitude. Okay? Now, on the sine curve, the start of the sine is designated where the curve crosses the middle going up. We designate the start of the cosine anywhere where it touches the max and goes down. So that's a starting point for the cosine. Okay? Now, what'll happen is it'll go down, it'll come up, and it'll come back up to the max, and that is another starting point. And the distance from there to there is the period. And when it goes from max to max, that is one cycle. And so with those two ideas, this letter B equals the number of cycles in 360 degrees or in 2 pi. 360 degrees or 2 pi radians, those are the same. And then the period, which is the length, is equal to 360 divided by b, or 2 pi divided by b, depending on whether you're in degrees or radians. And remember, the period is the length of the curve, the sine or the cosine curve. Okay, so lastly, we have this letter H, and that is the phase shift, which is a horizontal shift. And so, if instead of this maximum, this starting point, if it, instead of being at 0, if it were here at 90 degrees and our curve did something like this, okay, you'll notice that this whole thing is shifted 90 degrees negative. And so that would be a phase shift or a horizontal shift. All right, that's all the information I'm going to provide in this video. I'm going to do another video that has examples so that it doesn't become too long. All right, there we go.